The late July sun beat down on the Chicago asphalt, reflecting heat waves that shimmered above the pavement as Sam navigated his practical, slightly battered sedan towards the suburbs. He loosened the collar of his off-duty polo shirt, the starched formality feeling alien after 12 hours in the familiar, functional uniform of a Chicago Fire Department paramedic. 12 hours of controlled chaos, sirens, frantic calls, the adrenaline surge of stabilizing a critical patient. The quiet ache after a call didn't end well. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and polite cocktail chatter awaiting him at his Aunt Carol and Uncle Richard's sprawling house in Oak Brook, family gatherings. Sam usually found excuses: an extra shift, mandatory training, sudden onset fatigue. It wasn't that he didn't love his family exactly. It was more the profound sense of disconnect. His parents, both partners at prestigious downtown law firms, and his aunt and uncle, comfortably ensconced in the world of finance, treated his career with a kind of baffled respect mixed with faint pity. Such important work, Sam, must be so taxing, his mother would say, her tone implying it was also vaguely unpleasant and certainly not something one discussed in detail over hors d'oeuvres. They celebrated billable hours and successful depositions. Sam measured success in saved lives and calls, handled with calm competence under pressure. Their worlds rarely intersected in meaningful ways. This year, however, skipping wasn't an option. The family text chains had been buzzing for weeks, the usual lukewarm invitations replaced with near-mandatory summons. The reason, his younger cousin, Ethan. Ethan, just 22, had been pulled alive from the wreckage of that apartment building that partially collapsed over on the west side during the freak derecho storm last month. It had been all over the local news, dramatic footage, interviews with neighbors, the miracle survivor narrative. Ethan was, understandably, the man of the hour, the focal point around which this particular family gathering would revolve. Sam sighed, turning onto the familiar tree-lined street. He knew what to expect. Endless retellings of Ethan's ordeal, praise for his incredible strength and will to survive, maybe even slightly hushed tones about divine intervention. He felt a pang of something complex. Relief that Ethan was okay, of course, but also a deep weariness. He knew the reality of those scenes, the painstaking, methodical work of rescue teams, the critical interventions made long before the cameras arrived. He worried the family's dramatic retelling would overshadow the quiet professionalism of the first responders, or worse, veer into territory that felt disrespectful to the process, or to those who hadn't been so lucky. He parked down the street, taking a moment in the quiet of his car. He could already hear the high-pitched laughter of younger cousins from the backyard, the best thump of some inoffensive pop playlist, the sizzle and smell of Uncle Richard's industrial-sized grill. It was the soundtrack of suburban comfort, a world away from the urgent pulse of the city he'd left just hours before. Steeling himself, Sam got out and walked up the stone pathway. The front door was open, spilling cool air and conversation into the humid afternoon. He stepped inside, immediately feeling like an interloper in his simple polo shirt, amidst the crisp linen and subtle jewelry of his relatives. His Aunt Carol spotted him first, rushing over with a practiced socialite's embrace. "Sam, you made it! We were starting to worry!" she exclaimed, her eyes quickly scanning the room, perhaps noting who observed his arrival. "Ethan is out back, holding court, poor dear. Such an ordeal, but he's being so brave." Sam murmured a noncommittal response, accepting a glass of iced tea. He saw his parents across the room, deep in conversation with Uncle Richard, likely discussing market trends or legal precedents. His mother caught his eye and offered a tight, brief smile. Acknowledgement given, duty fulfilled. No one rushed over, no one asked about his week, his job, the calls he'd run just last night. He was here. That was enough. He was the dependable, slightly peripheral Sam, the EMT cousin whose job was important, of course, but not exactly material for celebratory toasts. Today, more than ever, the stage belonged entirely to Ethan, the miracle survivor. Sam braced himself for the performance. Sam found his way through the sliding glass doors to the sprawling backyard patio. It was peak suburban summer, tiki torches lit even in the afternoon sun, the chlorine tang of the pool mingling with the rich smell of barbecue, and classic rock competing with the happy shrieks of children playing Marco Polo. And there, seated in a cushioned patio armchair like a king holding court, was Ethan. He looked thinner, paler than Sam remembered, and his left arm was still in a supportive sling, but he managed a wan smile as various aunts, uncles, and cousins orbited around him. A small table beside him held cards, flowers, and half-eaten plates of food brought to him like offerings. Sam hung back near the drinks table, nursing his iced tea, observing the familiar dynamic unfold. Absolutely terrifying. I can't even imagine, Aunt Carol was saying, her hand fluttering near her chest. Trapped under all that rubble for hours. Richard and I were glued to the news, just praying. You were so brave, Ethan, Sam's mother added, leaning forward earnestly, to stay conscious through all that, waiting for rescue. Incredible fortitude. Ethan shifted slightly, a flicker of something unreadable. Discomfort? Exhaustion? Crossing his face before being replaced by the expected humble smile. I don't know about brave, he murmured. Mostly just scared. And lucky. Nonsense, boomed Uncle Richard, clapping Ethan gently on his good shoulder. Luck favors the prepared. You kept your head, son. That's what matters. He launched into a retelling seemingly gleaned from sensationalized news reports. They said the west wall just pancaked without warning during the storm's peak winds, and Ethan, quick as lightning, dove under that big oak desk just as the ceiling collapsed right on top of it, found himself in this tiny little void, pitch black, couldn't move. Sam listened, the professional part of his brain automatically cross-referencing the account with the dispatch logs and scene assessment realities of a structural collapse. Pancaked? More like a progressive collapse starting from a compromised load-bearing point. Dove under a desk? Possible, but finding a stable void in that kind of dynamic event is pure chance, not foresight. He noticed details being omitted. The likely dust inhalation, the risk of crush syndrome, the complex process of shoring up unstable debris before even attempting entry. And the rescue itself! Aunt Carol picked up the thread, her eyes wide. They showed that firefighter rappelling down 3 stories, said it was a miracle they even located you amidst the chaos. Rappelling, Sam thought. It was a ground-level access point after the search dogs got a hit, then hours of careful debris removal by the USAR team. He took another sip of his tea, the gap between the dramatic narrative and the methodical, often dangerous reality of rescue work widening uncomfortably in his mind. Ethan didn't correct them. Maybe his memory was truly hazy from trauma, or maybe it was easier to just accept the heroic version they seemed determined to create for him. His grandmother, Marion, ensconced in the shadiest spot under the large patio umbrella, chose that moment to chime in, her voice carrying clearly across the patio. Well, it just goes to show, she declared, adjusting the cardigan draped over her shoulders despite the heat. Ethan comes from strong stock, always had that fighter's spirit, that will to overcome, truly blessed. She paused, her gaze sweeping briefly over Sam before settling back on Ethan. Not everyone is built with that kind of resilience, you know. Some are just different. The implication, though vague, landed exactly as intended, drawing a familiar line between the celebrated survivor and the steady, less remarkable cousin who dealt with emergencies daily but without the dramatic headlines. Sam felt the familiar tightening in his chest, not anger but a profound weariness. They weren't just celebrating Ethan. They were reinforcing their own hierarchy of acceptable narratives, of praiseworthy struggles. They lauded the dramatic survival, but remained oblivious, or perhaps willfully ignorant, of the constant grinding resilience required in his own line of work. The resilience of showing up shift after shift, of managing chaos, of facing trauma routinely, of making life-or-death decisions without an audience or applause. He looked at Ethan again, who seemed to shrink slightly under the weight of the fighter's spirit label. The family continued to talk, layering more embellishments onto the story, crafting a legend in real time. Sam stayed silent, swirling the ice in his cup, the sanitized heroism of their narrative grating against the complex, messy truth he carried from that day. The chasm between his world and theirs had never felt wider. The afternoon wore on under the relentless Illinois sun, the air thick with humidity and the smell of grilled meat. Inside the bubble of the backyard party, the legend of Ethan's survival continued to inflate. Sam found himself cornered near the elaborate stainless steel grill listening to Uncle Richard, who seemed to have appointed himself the official bard of Ethan's ordeal. And showing incredible grit, Richard declared, emphasizing the word with a dramatic flourish of his spatula. Ethan managed to wedge himself into that tiny pocket when the floor above gave way. Just pure instinct, the will to live. The fire captain himself told the news crews it was remarkable anyone could have reacted that quickly. Nods of awe rippled through the cluster of relatives hanging on his every word. He always was a fighter, Aunt Carol added, dabbing her eyes theatrically. And truly blessed. When they finally cleared enough debris to reach him, he practically crawled right out to them. A little shaken naturally, but barely scratched. Sam felt a familiar weariness mixed with a rising tide of professional indignation. Crawled out, barely scratched. The simplification, the erasure of the painstaking, dangerous reality of urban search and rescue suddenly felt unbearable. He thought of the specialized teams, the hours of meticulous shoring and void searching, the constant risk assessment. He thought of the medical reality of crush injuries, dust inhalation, hypothermia. This sanitized fable wasn't just inaccurate. It felt like a dismissal of the very real stakes involved, stakes he dealt with every shift. He carefully placed his condensation-slicked glass of iced tea onto a nearby wrought iron table. The subtle clink seemed to momentarily puncture the self-congratulatory atmosphere. He took a breath, consciously relaxing his shoulders, deciding in that instant to break his long-standing habit of polite silence at these gatherings. Actually, Uncle Richard, Aunt Carol. Sam's voice was calm, measured, but clear enough to carry over the low thrum of conversation. It wasn't quite like that. He didn't crawl out. The effect was instantaneous. Conversations trailed off. Heads turned. Uncle Richard paused, spatula hovering over the grill, a look of mild annoyance crossing his face. What do you mean, Sam? That's the story Ethan told us, isn't it, Ethan? And the papers reported... Ethan, caught in the sudden spotlight, looked down at his lap, mumbling, well, it was confusing down there. He couldn't have crawled, Sam reiterated patiently, meeting his uncle's gaze directly, because when the first rescue crews reached him, his lower body was significantly pinned by a collapsed HVAC duct and sections of reinforced concrete. An uncomfortable silence descended, thicker than the humid air. Sam could feel his mother's eyes on him, silently pleading. His father stopped talking to a neighbor, turning his full attention, his lawyerly gaze sharp and analytical. Aunt Carol opened her mouth and closed it again, clearly affronted. Well, she finally managed. However did you come by such specific information, Sam? He let the question hang for a beat, letting the weight of the moment settle. Because I was there, he stated simply, holding their collective gaze. I was the lead paramedic on CFD Ambulance 61. We were the first advanced life support unit to make patient contact after the USARK-9s got the alert. The silence that followed was profound, stunned. The cheerful party chatter evaporated, replaced by the almost deafening sound of the cicadas in the trees and the distant shouts of kids in the pool. Uncle Richard stared, his mouth slightly agape. Aunt Carol took an involuntary step back. His father's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Sam with a new intensity. Grandma Marion suddenly seemed preoccupied with smoothing her skirt. Across the patio, Ethan's face was ashen, his eyes wide, fixed on Sam with a look that morphed from a confusion to dawning, shocked recognition. He knew. Or perhaps deep down, he had known all along, the trauma blurring the faces, but not the feeling of hands working urgently to save him. Sam felt the need to ground the revelation in undeniable fact, partly to preempt any dismissal, partly to honor the reality of the situation. We had difficulty establishing good IV access because of the angle he was pinned at in the dust. He continued, his voice still calm, professional. I remember having to cut away his jacket sleeve, that blue North Face one, to get to a viable vein in his forearm. His initial oxygen saturation was dangerously low, well below 85, indicating respiratory compromise. My partner performed rapid sequence intubation right there in the collapse zone before extrication was even complete, while USAR worked on freeing him. The clinical details, devoid of drama but painting a clear picture of critical intervention, landed with irrefutable weight. The heroic narrative of the self-sufficient survivor had evaporated, replaced by the complex team-based reality of emergency medical care and technical rescue. The family was left grappling with the fact that the person they routinely overlooked, whose job they vaguely pitied, had been a central life-saving figure in the very event they were celebrating with such second-hand fervor. Sam felt a strange mix of exhaustion and release. He hadn't sought this confrontation, hadn't wanted to steal Ethan's spotlight or make anyone uncomfortable, but the chasm between their perception and his reality had become too wide to silently tolerate any longer. In simply stating his truth, he had irrevocably altered the landscape of the afternoon, and perhaps much more. The stunned silence following Sam's revelation eventually fractured into brittle, forced pleasantries. Conversations restarted, carefully avoiding the topic of the rescue or Sam's involvement, focusing instead on safe subjects like weather and upcoming vacations. Relatives who had been clamoring around Ethan now seemed unsure how to interact with either cousin. Sam excused himself from the awkward cluster near the grill, finding a quieter spot on the porch steps, watching the lengthening shadows stripe the perfect lawn. He felt drained, but strangely lighter, as if shedding a weight he hadn't realized he carried. He hadn't sought to be the center of attention, only to gently correct the narrative with this quiet authority of fact. Later, as dusk settled and guests began gathering their belongings, Sam was heading towards his car when Ethan intercepted him near the driveway. His cousin looked pale under the porch lights, his usual confident energy replaced by a raw uncertainty. He shifted his weight, hands shoved deep into his pockets, avoiding Sam's eyes initially. "Hey," Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper. He finally looked up, his gaze searching Sam's face. That stuff you said back there about the rescue, was that really... were you... Sam met his gaze steadily. "Yeah, Ethan. I was the lead medic on the first ambulance." Ethan seemed to process this, his brow furrowing as if trying to reconcile hazy memories with the present reality. I remember sounds," he said slowly. "Shouting, metal scraping, and someone cutting my jacket. My blue jacket." His eyes widened slightly as the connection clicked. "That was you?" "My team and I were focused on stabilizing you," Sam replied gently, keeping his tone professional, matter-of-fact. "It was a complex scene. You were lucky the USAR teams were able to access your location relatively quickly." Ethan was silent for a long moment, staring down at the pavement. When he looked up again, his eyes were unexpectedly bright with unshed tears. Everyone keeps talking about how I was brave," he choked out. "But I wasn't brave, Sam. I was just... there. Terrified. You guys... you were the ones..." He trailed off, unable to articulate the enormity of his realization. He took a shaky breath. "Thank you," he whispered, the words raw with emotion. "Seriously, thank you. You saved my life." It wasn't the boisterous applause his family gave so freely for perceived successes, nor the grudging respect he sometimes received after a particularly challenging shift. This was something different. Raw, personal, profound. It was the simple, unadorned gratitude of someone acknowledging the reality of what had happened, acknowledging Sam's role not as a relative, but as a skilled professional who had intervened at a critical moment. "We were just doing our jobs, Ethan," Sam said quietly, though the words felt inadequate. "The whole team, CFD, USAR, everyone worked together, focused on recovering." Ethan nodded, wiping quickly at his eyes. "Yeah," he said, seeming a little more grounded. "Yeah, okay." They stood in awkward silence for another moment, the usual family dynamics replaced by this new, fragile understanding based on shared trauma. "Well, thanks," Ethan repeated, then turned and walked slowly back towards the house. Sam got into his car, the interaction replaying in his mind. He hadn't received an apology from his grandmother or a sudden outpouring of respect from his aunts and uncles. The fundamental disconnect probably remained, but this quiet, heartfelt acknowledgement from Ethan felt more substantial, more real than any performative applause could have. It wasn't the validation he might have craved as a younger man, but it was a form of recognition rooted in truth and shared experience. He realized, perhaps for the first time, that his sense of worth didn't need to come from their approval. It came from the quiet competence of his work, the knowledge that he made a difference, and moments like this. Unexpected connections forged in the crucible of reality, far removed from the family's carefully constructed narratives. He started the engine, pulling away from the curb with a sense of quiet peace he hadn't arrived with.